I can't do a top 10 this year, it's just not possible. Even if I was just limiting it to the games that released this year, which I don't do by the way, it would still be a really tough ask. But when considering everything I played, new and old, I have to do a top 15, and even with that I'm still leaving out some great stuff. I will say in advance too, some big hitters I didn't play, either didn't have the platform, the time, or I've played it before. So no Rebirth, no Infinite Wealth, no Romancing Saga Remake, and no Daybreak. Also, same as previous years, it's gonna be one per franchise. Anyway, let's just get started. Number 15 is going to be this cozy action RPG from a well-known franchise and from a sadly now defunct developer in Oka Studios. Oh, Visions of Mana. The only thing I could think of as the credits rolled was what could have been. The game was good, but it could so easily have been great, and this is not the fault of Oka Studios themselves. I can only imagine what it must have been like knowing your job was effectively over when the game was complete. Having that hanging over your head while working must have been distracting to say the least. That they were able to create this while under that stress is a testament to their character. Visions of Mana is one of those JRPG comfort foods that will never lose charm, a by-the-numbers fantasy adventure that allows you to get lost in its gorgeous world. And it is gorgeous. The art team were on top form the entire way through. You know you've done something right when a player just stops to take in the vistas. The action-based combat, though a bit clunky, is decent enough with the ability to switch jobs between all characters, and the OST fits the theme of the lands you're exploring at any given time. So there are a lot of positives. Though in the same breath, Visions of Mana has problems mainly in the second half. The first half I see as the main vision, if you will, of Visions of Mana, what they intended. The latter half was the rushed part, where they were pressured to get things done before the inevitable axe came down from NetEase Games. Story didn't do anything for me, a horrible antagonist all said and done, and a few bugs here and there. It has a place in any backlog though. Anyone looking for an adventure-style action RPG could do far worse than Visions of Mana. And let me mention again, it is pure eye candy. I can't stress that enough. But just before we carry on, I want to make you guys aware that YouTube memberships are now available if you want to support the channel. For £4 a month, a member can get some awesome benefits like these custom-made membership badges. Alternatively, you can support me on Patreon as well, where you can vote on future videos, get handwritten Christmas cards like this one, or partake in the quarterly giveaways. We've given away some really cool stuff this year, like the limited edition of Metaphor ReFantasio. Thank you for listening, and now back to the video. Talking about eye candy, number 14 will be for Grand Blue Fantasy Relink, the long-delayed and awaited title from Cygames that finally saw the light of day. Now here's the thing, if I was a person who likes the loop of a Monster Hunter style game, you know, kill monsters for loot and make equipment to kill bigger monsters, rinse and repeat, I would have put Relink a lot higher on the list. The main essence of Relink is in that endgame content after the story concludes. But that's not for me, and it never has been. The only time I really engage in something like that is in MMOs. I don't do as such in single-player RPGs. For Relink, it was as usual for me. Play through the story, complete a few side quests, watch the credits roll and move on. No doubt that Relink was a great game to me when just considering that approach. Cygames did a solid job all said and done. It's beautiful, it's polished, and it's got some notable high points in the story. You can talk about the substance of that narrative being a bit shallow and by the numbers, but the actual presentation of it was top tier. Spectacle for me is just as important as the writing. We have eyes for a reason. And this game nails spectacle, the boss battles in particular being the highlights. The combat itself is fun, purely due to its variety. You've got a wide array of characters to use with their own unique control schemes, and you can certainly see the appeal of enhancing equipment and sigils for the tougher missions. All in all though, the game took me just under 30 hours, and that was more than enough to keep me satisfied. A shorter game from 2024, but a memorable one. Short cannot be said for number 13 though, and that is for the first game that didn't release in 2024 with Bravely Default 2. For reference, this one took me 42 hours to finish and could have easily been far more if I didn't find the optimal grinding spots. Bravely Default 2 is a game that is all about the player. It puts full control in the hands of the one holding the controller and leaves it up to them. What the player puts into it is what they get out of it. Bravely Default 2 is effectively an older Final Fantasy game in all but name. Makes sense considering what the original was meant to be all those years ago. It has a story centered around crystals of power, a job system, and that high fantasy setting. That being said, Bravely Default 2 does more than enough to stand on its own 2 feet. The Brave and Default combat style, for instance, is just excellent to work with and quite challenging in the early stages. Well, it is challenging until you dig into the job system. 24 jobs, 3 of which are optional, and it's undoubtedly the highlight of the game. Ludicrously fun and flexible. You learn a bunch of skills, both active and passive, as you level these up to a max of 15, and you can combine a main and sub job at any time you wish. It's that freedom that allows a player to outright break the game at any point, which is fine by me. Breaking a game by understanding mechanics is not a bad thing, and never will be. That's called rewarding players who comprehend the tools they're working with, and long may it continue. It's only available on 2 platforms, PC and Switch, but if you have one of those available, give it a whirl because it deserves any JRPG fan's time. Unfortunately, I cannot so easily recommend playing number 12, simply because even now it is stuck on the PS2 and 3DS, 2 platforms that have long ended production. But with the recent remastered project from Bandai Namco coming into motion, there could be a chance that Tales of the Abyss will get the same treatment as many of its contemporaries. And I hope it does get that attention. Tales of the Abyss is easily in my top 2 Tales of games to date. It equals Berseria, or at least comes very close to it. It is a game that combines the great battle system of the franchise with an actual nuanced and deep story, helmed by one of the best protagonists in any JRPG. You could say what you want about Luke in the early stages, but his development to what he eventually becomes is expertly handled. It's not a case that the guy changes on a whim. The characteristics of that change are made apparent to the player even in the early stages, and the game sets the foundation superbly for his eventual moment of enlightenment. Abyss is the game I will point to when anyone says to me that Tales of games aren't known for their story. It's not an excuse anymore. Berseria had a great story, and Abyss has an equally strong story. They've done it before, and they can do it again, I'm sure. Speaking of doing it again, number 11 was the second game in a bundle released back in 2023. Well, the first if you consider it's a prequel, but generally speaking you play this one second. Barton Kaitos Origins. The original last year was easily in my top 3 games of 2023. It was just so unique and fresh compared to anything else I played that year. Sure, it had some moments of frustration, but the package overall was just first-class stuff. A turn-based RPG centered around a deck builder. And Origins was more of the same at its core. While I do prefer the original in terms of story and music, Origins definitely has the better combat for me. It is breakneck speed but still maintains the difficulty of Barton Kaitos as a series. The intricacy of the system is entirely tied to your deck, as is the ability to overcome any obstacle. I'll argue this point till I hang up my controller. Barton Kaitos, both games, never feel cheap in terms of difficulty. There are no mechanics that feel outright busted and derail your entire fight because you always have a counter centered around the balance of your deck. If you're having trouble, your first port of call is making sure the deck is optimal. Do you have enough defense-based cards? Maybe you don't have the composition for frequent combos. It's all on the player. And Barton Kaitos Origins just embraces that approach. Its combat is so fast and yet equally so fun. Scanning across the cards, switching between members to extend combos, it is a joy when you see a full combo through. This and the original are undoubtedly 2 of the most underrated and underappreciated games I've seen in recent years, and I'm happy to sing their praises whenever I can. And that sentiment remains as we break into the top 10, and we're coming into games now that are at least an 8.5 out of 10, hence why it was so difficult for me to compile a list this year. But number 10 is going to Witchspring R. This here is a game that combines Atelier with a deeper story in creature taming. Witchspring R is just such a great experience from start to finish. It's helmed by a fantastic protagonist in Pieberry, a happy-go-lucky witch whose only purpose in life at first is to just find pie for herself. That motivation soon expands though, and the story becomes more meaningful as the hours pass by. It's satisfying, it's well told, and Pieberry herself develops extremely well throughout that time. And part of that development will come from the player themselves. Players are free to boost Pieberry's stats however they want, and import is put on exploring the world to find additional pets, which will open up previously inaccessible areas. You'll also need to scout out materials for better equipment, and also find those excellent side quests, of which there are plenty to find in the world. You can constantly feel the tangible progression that Witchspring R offers, and it keeps the experience engaging throughout its relatively short runtime of about 20 hours. It's a brilliant game, and well worth its asking price of just under £30. And I hold the same opinion for number 9, Megaton Musashi W Wired. The game that was sadly forgotten by level 5 this year, so much so that the players had to advertise it for them. They have got to be one of the most frustrating developers from Japan. They make consistently brilliant games, but they have no idea how to market them. Not to mention they're not so good at releasing games on time either. I fully expect Deca Police is going to get pushed to 2027 after its most recent delay. Yet even when they do release a game, they just give up on it before it even has a chance to swim. And Megaton Musashi Wired was one such release. What a shame, because this here was the sleeper hit of 2024 for me. It was the one that very few knew about, and it deserved so much more fanfare than what it was afforded. I maintain this opinion. Megaton Musashi Wired is a better Grand Blue Fantasy relink. It has a similar approach to gameplay, but it's got a much better story, a stronger set of characters, and far deeper customization tied to the mech units. Sure, the story somewhat falls apart by the end, but about 90% of it was top tier up to that moment. And as such, I don't want to come down too hard on it when it gave me such a great experience up till then. It was a pleasant surprise for me this year. As was number 8, and that was even being aware of its shortcomings, at least for me. Final Fantasy XVI. It came out on PC this year, so I had a chance to give it a go. And what a game. You know, this here is an enigma because Final Fantasy XVI is not what I look for in the series. It has common elements here and there, like the idea of crystals in the world, chocobos and all that jazz, but its actual RPG fundamentals are bare. No buffs or debuffs, no elemental weaknesses, very few opportunities to switch characters, no mini-games as you see in earlier Final Fantasy games. A lot of the stuff I associate with Final Fantasy as a series just isn't there. And I couldn't help but get the feeling it was trying to copy other games like The Witcher or Devil May Cry. But you know what? I don't care, because Final Fantasy XVI was just a ride. It was a game that balanced a gripping and engaging story, a strong host of characters, and high-octane cinematic sequences. The boss battles in Final Fantasy XVI are without question the best I've ever seen. These are what boss battles are meant to be if the budget allows. The spectacle, the theatre, the build-up, it's superb, and even then, I was pretty much on board with all of the main developments within the story. Funnily enough, the narrative at least became more Final Fantasy-like as the hours passed by, and the OST by Soken was as brilliant as ever. Say what you want about Final Fantasy XVI, but it's one of the best experiences I've had with the series to date. And the same holds true for number 7, because Atelier Esker and Logi ended up being my second favourite Atelier game in the series, and I've since played all of the modern mainline games. Esker and Logi just did so many things right. It was the game that, despite having a time limit, ensured that you barely even noticed its existence. It placed a lot of importance on the gear and equipment you used, which is the hallmark of Atelier, and it was led by two brilliant protagonists in Esker and Logi themselves, along with the ability to choose which one you want to play as. But then, it excelled because of its surprisingly somber story surrounding the dusk phenomena, and it also had one of the best iterations of alchemy in the series to date. The alchemy system offered by Esker and Logi was by far and away the highlight of the game. Everything felt streamlined to work in the player's favour, but not to the point that it was holding their hand. It is the perfect mix of accessibility and depth. There were many instances where I played an Atelier game and it felt like the system was trying to be overly complex that it started working against me, but not so in Esker and Logi. The alchemy skills were interwoven expertly into the mould of the crafting itself, and it just made it a joy to work with from start to finish. While Sophie 2 remains my favourite in the series, Esker and Logi more than earned its place at the higher echelon of Atelier games. And if we're touching on upper echelons of games, this one at number 6 isn't just at the top of its genre, it's arguably among the pinnacle within gaming, period, and that is Chrono Trigger. Now here's the thing, I will always prefer modern games. I don't have any nostalgia for older titles, and no matter how many I play, I do see the odd flaw here and there. A design choice that just doesn't work for me. Whether it be exceedingly high encounter rates or a lack of direction in a vast world, the perceived aging of an older game is what keeps me coming back to modern games in the majority. Chrono Trigger is the only one to this day that I look at differently. This is a game that released in 1995, and if it came out in 2024 exactly as it was back then, it would still be one of the best JRPGs of the year. The quality of the game is so embedded in its code that it becomes timeless. The pacing is excellent, the music is top tier, the story is simple but presented exceedingly well, and the idea of time travel as a mechanic is utilised adeptly. It's integrated into everything that defines Chrono Trigger as an experience, ensuring that its smaller world feels larger as you travel across different eras, and also presenting opportunity for characters to right wrongs in their own lives. In addition, Chrono Trigger's premise also gives us one of the best antagonists in any RPG, which is saying a lot, considering that it's not some sort of mastermind with a multi-layered motivation. It's just a pure, primal threat that even time itself can't escape. The fact that Chrono Trigger is just outside my top 5 in 2024 despite my preferences for modern games should speak volumes for how good it really is. And it wasn't just Chrono Trigger I experienced for the first time in 2024, I also got a shot at a classic Atlas title, albeit as a remake that came out early in the year. Persona 3 Reload kicks off the top 5, and there was no doubt to me it was going to be high up on the list when I put it together. Now Reload did draw ire from those who played FES and Portable in particular, but that wasn't me. This was my first exposure to Persona 3, and it was as positive as I could have hoped. As an introduction to a classic within the series, this was perfect. Persona 3 Reload moulded itself to fit an audience who were introduced to the series with Persona 5. A lot of the mechanics in the game, like the combat for instance, took on a similar structure, targeting weaknesses and then using an all-out attack for instance. The social link aspects were as expected, plenty of character stories all centered around a central theme that formed the basis of the narrative itself. While I do prefer Persona 5 Royal overall, I do prefer the story in Reload, purely because of how focused it is around its core theme and how it explores it in multiple ways. It's one of those games that starts slow and just gets better over time. The only reason I put Reload lower than the other 4 entries is because of Tartarus. I'm not a fan of dungeon crawlers, and Tartarus is effectively one giant dungeon that you consistently revisit. Otherwise though, Persona 3 Reload was never going to be anywhere but the top 5 for 2024. So what manages to pip a game like Persona 3 Reload? Well, a game that doesn't have a dungeon like Tartarus would help, and that's exactly the case with Dragon Quest III HD 2D. This was one of the last games I played this year, but it was immediately going on the list within 5 hours of my adventure starting. Dragon Quest III HD 2D was much like Bravely Default 2 to me, and the excellent Octopath Traveler 2 from last year. It was all about player agency and freedom. You get your mission from the king and you just go out in the world to do your own thing. Figure it out yourself. See a dungeon? Why not? That tower on that nearby island. How do I get there? Ransack a few houses for equipment. It's my choice. I adored the freedom that Dragon Quest III gave me, and it really did feel that the game stuck to the original's roots outside of the obvious additions to quality of life and the new art style, something that was confirmed to me by the resident expert on Dragon Quest, David Vince. It's just one of those cozy adventure style RPGs, much like Visions of Mana was this year, but unlike that game, Dragon Quest III never falters. I always felt engaged while playing the game, and that is the mark of a brilliant RPG. Which is exactly what we can say about the final 3 as well, which was so difficult for me to split that I contemplated flipping a coin. But instead, I just went for the simplest metric I could think of. An easy one to grasp, but the most important for me. Which game did I have the most fun with this year? And with that in mind, number 3 goes to Metaphor ReFantazio. Atlus were on fire this year, but this one was the best that they developed in my eyes. Effectively the inaugural project of Studio Zero, this one was in the oven for nearly a decade, announced way back in 2016. But man, was it worth the wait. Is it similar to Persona 5? Sure, but it does more than enough to stand on its own 2 feet as well. And even still, who's going to turn down more press-turn combat? I know I'm not. Metaphor ReFantazio is a straight-up triumph of 2024, a juggernaut JRPG, and I'm certain it's going to be remembered as one of the finest to ever release in the coming years. A beautiful world, excellent combat, brilliant OST, a decent story, and one of the better antagonists for me. It's nice to have an antagonist like the one we were given in Metaphor for a change. There's just so much to like about Metaphor ReFantazio, and it was well deserving of its plaudits in 2024. It's nice to see that long development cycle rewarded. And speaking of long development cycles, this one was even more involved, 10 years from first conception to release. In a certain way, it was another triumph for Atlus because they did publish this one, but really, the true praise should be going to Vanillaware for their work on Unicorn Overlord, which will be the game that takes number 2 for the list. I'm so happy that Unicorn Overlord saw success this year. Vanillaware have a habit of going over budget, and it was no different for this game. They effectively ran out before the end, and you can definitely see that stretched resource in the later parts of the adventure. Granted, it still maintains a notable high quality right to the end, all with that signature art style that Vanillaware are known for. They deserve all of the success they get, whereas some other studios will put out shovelware on the regular, Vanillaware choose to take their time and put real care into their games, and that reputation has preceded them with this latest entry. Granted, some of them don't hit since they often spread games out over multiple genres, but you can always tell you're playing a game from Vanillaware, no matter what genre it may be. And they've done it again with Unicorn Overlord. It is quite simply one of the finest tactical games out there. It's going to be remembered in the same bracket as Final Fantasy Tactics and Tactics Ogre, without question. People will draw up lists 10 years down the line of the best tactical RPGs, and Unicorn Overlord is going to be on there, every time. The depth, the customization, the music, it's just at such a high level. And yeah, the story is as vanilla as it gets, but the objective is always clear: retake Elaine's home. It's nice to have simplicity like that once in a while. It's still a well-told story, but the gameplay is certainly the focus. The only real negative I can think of is that Unicorn Overlord is never coming to PC. I mean, that's just a Vanillaware thing, and I don't think it's going to change for the near future, but otherwise, it gets a big fat seal of approval from me, and many others who played it as well. Can that same sentiment be said for my personal game of the year? Maybe not. The wider reception of Unicorn Overlord and Metaphor was more positive on the whole for those games, but again, I bring it back to that singular metric. Which game did I have the most fun with this year? And the answer was clear for me. It was clear within 5 hours of playing. East 10 Nordics is my game of the year for 2024. If you've kept up with the videos I released this year, then you probably already knew this would be the case. I pretty much said that East 10 Nordics was my game of the year, and sure enough, that opinion has not changed. It ticked every box for me. I latched onto the new combat immediately, which felt more impactful and intricate than the group-based games. I loved the story, the music was on point for the most part, and Kaja was just such a breath of fresh air as a partner for Ad-Hoc. Even the sailing mechanic, this was a snagging point for some, but that was exactly the same criticism aimed at Wind Waker when it first released, and that is still my favourite Zelda game to date. There's just a liberating feeling you get when sailing the waves, and Nordics has that atmosphere down to a T. Exploring islands, taking out enemy fleets, recapturing forts, this was the natural evolution of the East series for me. I want more worlds like this one in future entries. Now of course there is a little bit of a cloud surrounding East 10 as Falcon have seen fit to release an enhanced version of the game called Proud Nordics for Japan in 2025, and you'd imagine that will come west as well. If what I'm seeing is correct, it appears to be a brand new version of the game, which I'm not too thrilled with. I understand it's been done before with Tokyo Xanadu and Ys 8, but they were stuck on the Vita at first before getting expanded versions for consoles. Ys 10 was already multi-platform upon release, so I'm not seeing the logic here. Either way, that won't curtail my love for Ys 10 Nordics. Is it my favourite in the series? No, Ys 8 is still the pinnacle for me, but Nordics is certainly in the spot just below it. Thank you for watching this video. If you liked it, please like and subscribe for more JRPG content, and consider joining my Patreon if you're interested. Peace!